Good afternoon, Dr. Ghosh.
Yeah, good afternoon. Just give me 1 minute, huh? Just 1 minute.
Okay. Yes, sir. Shall we start?
So, yeah, yes.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the FEDI monthly discussion forum. I hope you all are doing well and taking adequate care still, though apparently it looks like that we are out of the difficult times and life is looking like coming back to normal. But I still suggest that it's always advisable to take adequate care and continue taking the precautions which we are taking in the difficult times which we had come through. So, as we all know, for quite some time, we have been living through the challenging times when we thought that the COVID is behind us and we were hoping that life is coming back to normal. The world has got hit by another geopolitical troubles and the problems. In these difficult times, one positive news which has come in the recent past is about economy doing pretty well and our export performance, which for the first time as a country, we hit 400 billion for the merchandise export in a financial year. So obviously a very encouraging achievement, very encouraging performance. But as we all know, sometimes the headlines are not necessarily giving us the true picture and the clear picture. And it's always useful to deep dive into all these issues and try to get more insight into what lies beyond the headline. And for that purpose, today, as part of our monthly discussion forum, we have invited Dr. Soumya Kanti Ghosh. I'm sure that most of you being from the banking industry would be knowing Dr. Ghosh, but still, I think it's my moral duty to give a brief introduction. Dr. Ghosh is a Group Chief Economic Advisor for State Bank Group. And prior to joining State Bank Group, he has also been associated with Tata AIA, Amex, ICRA. And one thing which I would like to mention is that Dr. Ghosh is the co-author in pioneering work of the capturing payroll data in India. And this is something which started only in the very recent past. And he has also been actively involved in designing the PM Kisan and ECLG scheme for the MSME sector. Dr. Ghosh is a member of working group which is looking at the revision of wholesale price index. And since continuously for 4 years till 2021, he has been identified as the best individual for doing research in India by the Asset magazine. So I think I can go on and on about his credentials and the achievements which he has made. But then I won't be doing justice to all your time. Obviously, you have come here not to listen to me, but to have his views and what he sees and how he interprets the India's recent performance on the export front. So with that, I welcome you, Dr. Ghosh, and happy to have you today with us. And to set the ball rolling, maybe I'm sure that you can totally give it a different perspective. You can go to the extent maybe I may not have visualized or anticipated. But first, one thing which comes to my mind, and that's where I would like to start today's discussion, is that when you look at the export performance, which I think 418 billion for the financial year 21-22. That's the number which we have clicked. We are talking about the merchandise export. We are keeping the services export out of it. And what are the key components in terms of categories of the exports? What kind of basically that segments which have done well? And as we all know, because of that ongoing global tensions, dislocations, etc., many of the commodities prices also have gone up. So one thing which comes to mind very often is that, is this achievement purely price driven or it is volume driven? And the next question which comes along with that is that, what is the component of the price versus the volume in this achievement, and how sustainable in your opinion is this trend which we have seen, almost more than 40% growth in that export performance in 1 year? And maybe if you can start with that, and then we'll look at what are the more things we can dig into. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And thank you for the opportunity to address this audience today. I think I have been also itching for an offline interaction for a long time, and hopefully I think the time is getting nearer and nearer. So I don't think time will only get nearer as we move up in the next fortnight or so. So I actually very honestly have given up on mask. So I may be giving the lecture in-house, but I have given up on mask, I mean, in a very large way. That may be correct or may be incorrect, but I mean, I just want to get rid of that after two years in using that. Hopefully, I think those will take that booster dose, I think all of us at some point of time. So maybe over the next 3 to 4 months, we should be okay. And the good thing is that, and I think I'm not a pandemic expert, but the important point when looking globally at the experience of the pandemic, I can visualize that India, of course, during the second wave, when the second wave started, India's vaccine preparation was not that satisfactory. But I think India has done quite remarkably in terms of the vaccination coverage. We have vaccinated more than 180 crore people as of now. And I think our vaccination and the CDO survey results will be out soon. And my sense is that a large part of the population will see that will be exposed to the immunity. And this is a good thing because we have allowed the virus to travel through the population. So therefore, we have developed immunity. And now we have been all talk about the developing economies. We all talk about their vaccine, their health coverage. But my sense of satisfaction in the last 1 year, when I look into our one, even after taking into account the devastating second wave, I think our immunity and living in a country like India may have helped us very well. And the first lockdown, which was implemented very rapidly, I think that also could have saved us for a natural calamity. Anyway, these are my thoughts, and this is not related to today's discussion, but I thought that I'll just share this optimism with all of you that maybe going forward, we'll be in a much better position, so that so as to give up on this mask and other things. Now, regarding the today's presentation, when sir just approached me for this presentation, I thought it was the best opportunity for me to work on this export growth. We have been actually toying up with this idea of this export growth, and I have told my team, believe me, that when the questions has been raised just now in terms of an price impact and quantity impact, we had a discussion with the RBI governor and RBI DGs also last week before the policy, and there also we had the same question, that the way these things are moving, the way this conflict is moving, the impact on the external sector, the impact on the current account deficit is surely going to breach the 2.5% mark next year, whether it is sustainable. So a question which came up during that point of time, and I think this is very important, and I'll address that question right away today, apart from the several other issues, is that whether it is a price effect and a quantity effect. As all of you know, if it's a quantity effect, as far as the exports are concerned, it is sustainable. But in imports, if it's a price effect, it's not sustainable because you have to pay for a higher price. But in exports, if you're actually exporting higher quantity, that is sustainable. So I will address these questions beforehand, And before I start the presentation, just give me 10 seconds. I'll share my screen with you, my presentation, and then we can take it to the in the next course of the next half an hour or so. I think I am visible. My presentation is visible to all of you.
Yes, sir. We
Okay.
can see it.
So basically, the title of the presentation, as I suggested, is merchandise exports have crossed 400 billion. I think 417 billion to be more precise. So what is the next? So what we in the next in the next half an hour or so, I'll just take you through some of the insights of the present of what actually is happening. Just give me 1 minute as I navigate. Yeah. So India's merchandise exports have actually touched a record 418 billion in FY22. This has exceeded the government targets by about 5%. This is a 40% growth over the previous year. And we have grown in petroleum products, engineering, gems and jewelry, chemicals and pharmaceuticals. So if you look into them, it's an export growth which has been driven by high skilled exports, also by items of discretionary consumptions like gems and jewelry, and also in emerging sectors like chemicals and pharmaceuticals because of the pandemic. So I think we have grown almost in all the segments. I'll show you the data as we show you later on. This 300 billion mark was actually achieved in FY12, if I remember. So by that logic, India took a decade to add 100 billion to its exports. So it was slow and steady. But we touched another 100 billion we added from FY12 to FY22. So basically, every year we added around 5 billion incremental to our exports if you go just by a simple arithmetic. The export values of 100 billion to 200 billion was reached in 5 years, FY6 to FY11. So we did 100 billion in 5 years, but we did 100 billion actually in the next 10 years. So there are a lot of reasons behind that, but I'll get into some of the reasons later on. But there have been various factors which has contributed to this achievement. First is that the exports of finished on intermediate goods have picked up significantly. India is now no longer an exporter of primary goods. There has been also an element of free trade agreements, which perhaps is playing and will play a major role in the future. There is a massive push from the production linked incentive scheme I'll show you. And of course, there has been multi-year high commodity and food prices, which it looks will continue to be there in this year also. Next, if I go into the next one, I think exports and goods and services. This is another historical data. This is an 40-year-old data. So Indian exports and goods services was 3.7% in 70. In a decade, it was 6.9% in 1980. Then in the next 3 decades, it touched a high of 25.4%. So around 2.5% share in GDP was incrementally achieved over a period of 10 years, and close to 20% share in incremental share in GDP was added over a period of 3 decades from 1980 in 2013, and then it started to decelerate. It touched 18.7% in 2020. So I think over a period of 7 years, we actually lost the exports as a percentage of GDP declined by 7%. FY22, the share of exports have already crossed 20.8%. It is now close to 21%. If we assuming that this growth rate is at 18%, basically I have assumed is 18 to this year, the growth rate has been more than 40%. If we are assuming that this year it grew at 18 to 20%, the share could reach the peak again in FY26. So we can see that we have actually turned a full cycle from 70s to 80s to 2013, 2013 to 2020, and again from 2020 till 2026, we are going to hit the share. So basically, I mean, it will almost take the same number of years to reach that peak in 2013, which we have lost in 7 years from 2013 to 2020. So that actually indicates that India's exports and goods and actually closely related to the global growth. And if you just look into the data a little bit carefully, you will see that when the global exports and goods and services rises, India always rises at a faster pace. Look into the figure from 2002 to 2008. You can see that the Indian share actually has been much steeper, but the Other thing is that when the global exports decline, India decelerated even at a much faster pace. So it's actually a double whammy. When it grows faster than global exports of goods and services. But when it declines faster than exports of goods or services. So that is one point which we need to highlight. And this trend actually, I mean, generally lasts around a period of 4 to 5 years, if I am correct. So basically, we can expect that the next couple of years could be growth rate on the part of the Indian exports and goods and services. That's why it is important for the government, and it is trying to do that to make these growth in exports and goods and services basically more agnostic, so that a part of it depends on the global cycle, and the part of it is also automatic in terms of the policy initiatives which the government can actually do in the quest for pushing up India's share of exports of goods and services. Now, having said that, let me now give you a data of exports and goods and services. I also kept the services over here, although it's a presentation mostly on goods exports, but just want to give you some numbers over here. Indian exports and goods and services expected to be around 244 billion for FY22. Goods exports is as 420 billion, so total is around 661 billion. Service exports in total exports today is 27% to 41%, but it is moderated slightly in FY20 to 37%. Why I am showing you the share of exports of the goods and services separately is that I think there has been recently a debate which has been initiated by former RBI Governor also Dr. Rajan, saying that India should concentrate more on services and less on this goods promotion, because that is one way to actually integrate into the global economy. So that's why I wanted to show you the numbers, and then I will argue which basically provides a better opportunity, whether goods and the services or both of them. So that's the purpose of giving you the hindsight of these numbers. Now, this is another one, the export growth and global GDP growth. The decline in the share of exports, if you can again look into the last 10 years data, I think it's basically because of the deceleration of the economy. Exports growth and GDP growth rate are positively correlated and reinforce each other. Again, in this case, the important point is that if you look into Indian exports actually have declined. The share of Indian exports to GDP has declined not precipitously during the period FY19 till FY21, but the share actually has improved precipitously if you move from FY21 to 22. A part of this could be the base effect, but as I will show you, of course, there is something cooking in the export story of India. Otherwise, the significant jump in the growth rate in the last 1 year was not possible, a 40% growth rate. And this is not to show off a negative pace in FY21, as I will compare the numbers also with the pre-pandemic level. Now, let me now turn on to some of the important points. If you actually look into the data, the last 25 years of data, this is basically the export basket of India for FY98, 2001 and 2022. If you look into the last 25 years of data, 10 major export partners of India, 6 remains the same. However, there are some countries which have come up the ladder. For example, Japan, Italy, Russia, and France have been replaced by China, Bangladesh, Netherlands, and Singapore in terms of an export promotion. So Indian exports actually have been moving more and more towards South-South trade. Share of USA in our exports has increased to 20.9% in FY 2001. It was 19.4% in FY 98. It has actually declined in FY 22. So, but our exports to Bangladesh, China, Singapore, and Netherlands is increasing. And the point is that India's export diversification, as I will show you, as you can see in the next slide, has been significant in the last 24 years. And I think that is actually a very good development. Till FY 2000, in not many developing countries were our export destination. China was not even in the top 10. In FY 2001, China was the 15th largest export destination with a share of less than 2% of our exports. In FY 22, the share is actually 5.4%. In fact, FY 21, China's share was more than 7%, but it dipped during the pandemic, I think because of a slowdown from China. But still, the share of China in our exports is actually third. So when we argue that yes, we have a large trade deficit with China, but we should also appreciate the fact that India's exports to China is now third highest in terms of this overall share in the exports. The concentration of 10 countries in our export basket has reduced over the 10 years. So that shows that India has been able to reduce the concentration risk. The share of others have increased, thereby implying diversification of export destination. I will share the slide with you so you can actually look into the numbers. For example, top countries among others in FY98 was Malaysia, Canada, China, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. These countries today are Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Italy, Australia, South Korea. And you can know that India recently signed an agreement with Australia. So I think overall, we have been, and you can see in the numbers, Japan, share of UAE, share of USA, share of Italy. So I think there has been a churning in terms of the share. And UK, for example, UK share was 6% in FY98, but today the UK share is actually around 2.5%. So there is a churn. India's share has increased in terms of the South-South trading partners. India's share against USA increased and then have moderated. Share in the European Union has moderated, but it has increased for some specific countries. So on the whole, we have been able to reduce our concentration risk to a significant extent if we need to look into our broader export share. Now let me go into the next slide. This is basically why I wanted to show you India's direction of trade with APEC over time, because this is one of the large trading partners. And as you show at India's India's entry in the APEC, there has been a lot of difficulties. But that is an opportunity which India, even though it's not a part, you can see into India's exports in the APEC region, basically that all countries India are exporting, and they are exporting separately. Asia, Japan, Australia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, all countries India is exporting, and some of the countries which I mentioned over here actually is in the previous slide. India also imports a large from Asia. And Asia, basically, if you look into the India's exports to Asia, it's around 100 billion, and imports is actually close to around 150 billion. So basically, India runs a trade deficit, but there are countries whereby India is also exporting significantly to countries, which includes Bangladesh, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and other countries. Australia, I think we are trying to do it, and hopefully, over a point of time, Indian exports to this region could actually go, because some of these exporting in these regions have been repressed in the last couple of years. Japan is an obvious example of that. Now, this is the share of India's direction of trade with APEC. I think this is one issue which I wanted to share, because this is one where India can largely expand its trade. If you look into the share of the Indian exports, China is 13%. Asian developing countries is 48%, Singapore 5%. So all of us, we are entering, but we are not a part of this APEC. Imports are also, China, we are importing 22%, but there is a large scale debate of why it is not there. That's a separate issue. But if you look into the direction of India's trade with APEC countries, I think there is also a large opportunity which India can actually cultivate to increase in exports share to these countries. So this is one important point which I wanted to mention while pointing out the diversification of Indian export basket over the last 20 years or so. Now, if we look into the outlook of APEC trade and future opportunity, I'll come into other few countries dominate and determine India's APEC trade. You can actually see into the numbers over here. Under the current situation, it is therefore difficult for India to emerge as reliable alternative under China, because there are countries which are dominating and determining Indian APEC trade. Other countries in APEC, Vietnam and Indonesia, have attracted most of the relocating companies from China. Depreciation of rupee remains a concern when linking with GVC is the prime objective. India, there are studies with the Asia Development Bank which shows that India has actually moved up the gross value chain, but the rupee depreciation remains a concern, even though the rupee value has been largely stable in the last 2 years thanks to the RBI. Current trends looks like individual FTs will drive future trade, and this is important point. That's why I wanted to mention. If you look into the data over earlier, there are countries. I'll just show you. Basically, Australia, for example, is one of them. People's China is one. Bangladesh, Hong Kong, South Korea. So India and Australia have recently signed a comprehensive interim free trade agreement which provide zero duty express to 100% tariff lines from India to the Australian market. This is happening because India is actually not being allowed to be a part of the APEC. So that's why India is trying to develop individual FTAs with several countries so as to drive future trade. Tariffs will be eliminated on more than 85% of Australian goods exports to India, which will rise to about 91% over 10 years. 97% of Indian goods will immediately gain preferential access to Australia. So I think India has a very minuscule share in the exports to Australia if you look at the APEC trade. And I think because of these FTAs, and we can actually expect a large number of FTAs also in the future with some of these countries, and which is going to drive future trade with the APEC group of countries, which is basically a part of the other exports data, which I showed you at the beginning. So this is basically the importance of why we are on a hurry to sign some of the FTA agreements as the current Commerce and Industry Minister has been doing. Now, this is basically the most important slide. Now, let me come to the other important points, the price, quantity effect, and other things. Indian export basket, even though it has diversified into countries, but if you look into Indian export baskets, the top 15 exports account for 72% in our total exports. This is the data available till January FY22. The data, a large number of this data is not available after January, but the trend actually remains the same. A large number of these commodities shows higher export growth, not only over the corresponding period of FY21 also, FY20, FY19. So basically, if you look into, for example, this data of mineral fuels, it has not only grown over FY20, which was basically a distorted base because of the pandemic, but if you look into the FY19 numbers, they have also rose significantly. All numbers over here compare with the FY19, apart from apparel and clothing, where there has been a modest decline. I think all other items, India has been able to grow its exports significantly over the pre-pandemic level, which includes agricultural exports also, electrical machinery, pharmaceutical products, organic chemicals. And the important point of view is that the large part of some of these sectors, the government has also introduced an PLI incentive. So how the PLI incentive is going to help us, it may be too early to understand, but we have done some simulations to show you some of the results of how the PLI could actually reduce our import dependency. But the important point to us that the export story, top 15 exports, which account for 72% of our exports, if you look into them, they all of them show a significant amount of growth over FY19, indicating that this year export story is not exactly a flash in the pan. Now, let me go into the next slide. I think this is a very interesting example which we did. We basically did some simulations. So we wanted to isolate the price effect and the quantity effect. So what we did is that we looked into the data over a period of say 2 to 3 years. We looked into the prices of each of the items in the total commodities. And then what we did, I'll just give you, I'll not go to the technical details, but I'll just show you the methodology. So then what we did, we assuming that the price we had unchanged. So basically at the end of the total volume of imports or exports is equal to the price into quantity. So we assuming that the price had remained unchanged from the previous year, and then assuming that the prices had remained unchanged, we multiplied with that unchanged price over the previous year to isolate the quantity effect, and also then we changed that, and then we isolated the other impact as a residual one. So in this way, we did this for each and every commodity in the basket for exports and imports to understand whether it's a price effect and quantity effect. So then what we did, this was basically for the exports. We took the 50% in our export baskets. We calculated the products. Our estimates doing this methodology shows that 55% of the increase in exports was the quantity effect, and the rest 45% is the price effect. The numbers are all given below in terms of the several items. Our results show that only 31% in the increase in petroleum crude products in FY22 can be attributed to higher quantity, and 69% because of the price. I think this was expected. For certain commodities, including chemicals, leather, wares, and minerals, the quantity impact was the primary factor in driving exports in FY22 over FY21. higher quantity effect implies that the export momentums in the future could be sustained, because then it is not a flash in the pan. But you can see that some of the items, for example, like gems and jewelry, it was a pure quantity effect. Marine products, then papers and related products, petroleum products was mostly a price effect. Plantation was a quantity effect, and plantation actually we did very well in the agricultural export this year. Plastic and rubber articles was mostly a price effect. Textiles was a price effect and a quantity effect. I think this is one sector which we need to do a little better, and the government has introduced an PLI in the textile sector. So I think this is one area where we can do much better than our countries. And I think this is one of the reasons why India is trying to get into this APEC group of trading to the free trade agreements. Because India, I'll show you in the next slide that India has a comparative advantage in textiles and allied products. So this is one area of concern, of course. But if you look into the most of the leather is another one. Leather also, it was a quantity effect, but the share in exports is actually significantly on the lower side. So if I take all these factors into account, I think price effect was there, but the quantity effect had actually outpaced the price effect when you look into the exports. And that actually gives us a sigh of relief, meaning that the export growth this year, if it continues like that, this export growth, we may not be able to repeat the 40% growth, but at least we'll be able to do, even if you're able to do half of that, I think that will be much better, because it will be coming over a significantly larger base. Now, let me do the example. Let me do this exercise again for the imports. Imports also, we did the same thing. Imports, as you know, imports, if the impact is more of prices, that means it's an aberration. But if it is more of quantity, that means that actually means that there was a broken supply chain, or we have not been able to produce that quantity in large quantities during the year. Here, if you can actually look into these numbers, our imports have increased by 55% in 610 billion. The total value of these commodities increased by 76%. 26% is the quantity effect, and the rest 74% is the price effect. So we can understand that how this significant increase in the commodity prices is actually playing havoc with our exports. Out of 610 billion, 75% is actually the price effect, with meaning that actually, I mean, 400 billion or something we are paying actually through our nose in terms of the impact in the imports. Higher import value of petroleum crude and products in FY22 is mainly on account of high prices, which is basically 91%. So, and this is actually expected, because in a pandemic year, I don't think that there was a significant jump in the petroleum crude and products, but the price effect here actually is around 90%, and the quantity effect is around 9 to 10%, indicating that a large part of our imports has been distorted because of the global commodity price cycle. And wherever we are a price taker, like petroleum, chemicals, then the oats and minerals, even in agriculture, some of the base metals, all of these are actually more than 90%. And leather, other, I mean, paper related products. So, and here you can see that the price effect is actually dominating the quantity, and it shows that for 70 commodities which we did the exercise, the price effect has actually been larger than the quantity effect. So this shows that while we have been able in the exports, we have been effectively able to demonstrate that there has been a pickup and demand, and we capture some of the missing link in our export story. But in imports, it is largely a story whereby we have imported, and our imports have actually magnified because of a significant increase in prices. I think this is one important point which you want to mention. And this was actually one of the discussions also when we had met the RBI in March. The point to note over here is that when you are doing a balance of payment sustainability exercise, one need to separate the price and the quantity impact, and then see what is the sustainable BAP in terms of price and quantity. If it is, as I said, if it is more of on prices of imports and more of on quantity of exports, that means that even though the current account deficit may be elevated next year, where the deficit could be higher of 2.5%, I think we should not worry much about that, because that could be attuned with the business cycle which we are operating in. So I just wanted to make that clear. That's why I wanted to show you these numbers over here. Now, another thing is which I wanted to explore is that, and which I think there is a lot of debate, that we have a large trade deficit with China. Yes, But it's also a fact that India has been making unconscious attempt to reduce import dependency in China. Our imports in FY20 was 5 billion less. Our FY21 imports were 48 billion lower. But in FY22, possibly because of the disruptions, our imports from China have increased by 11 billion. So possibly the gains which we are making gradually that have been given away in 1 year. But the good thing is that the share in China's in total imports have moderated to 15.5%. So even though our imports absolute value from China has increased, the share is declining. The CAGR for India's overall imports between FY97 and 21 is 10.7%, but from imports from China is 20%. So that no wonder is China is our biggest importer. So I think this is the biggest problem in the last 24 years. Our imports from China is more than double than what we are importing from rest of the world. But on the other side, if you look into our exports to China, our share in China has been rising since FY17, but has fallen to 5.4% FY22. This is the point which I mentioned to you. When you compare the CAGR of India's overall merchandise growth between the last 24 years, India's overall CAGR is 9.9%, but that of exports to China is actually 14.5%. So while it is true that our imports are larger, much larger than that from China, but it is also true that in terms of the exports, we are slowly building up share. So 9.9 to 14.5. So basically we are going there, but the pandemic may have disrupted the BOP equation with China to a significant extent. So this is one thing which I wanted to highlight. Next is basically, this is a point of caution for us. I wanted to show the service one, as I said in the beginning. China's service exports is greater than India. The progress that India has made on the service is laudable. But if you can look into them, is that India exports a far greater amount of telecommunication, computer and information services from China, but China is rapidly catching up. Look at the number from 2005 and 2020. China is now at 59. India is actually at 68 in terms of the telecom computers. China is actually almost there. So this is one important point. I don't have the latest data, but latest data should be very interesting to see. But I still believe India is higher than China, but the gap has actually significantly narrowed down from 2017 onwards, when China had decided that it is the time now for them to jump into the service sector bandwagon, given the fact that it has exhausted mostly its entry into the manufacturing export growth. So this is one point which we should be very careful, and that's why it is important that you also concentrate on the services story. This is another important one, India's real comparative advantage over China. You look into all these products, we did an exercise to understand in which product India has a real comparative advantage. India has certain goods real comparative advantage. This includes chemicals, minerals, stone and glass, animal and vegetable oils. China has comparative advantage in many goods where India has. Such goods includes footwear, hides and skins, metal, textiles and clothing. But India is actually doing much better in textiles and clothing and metals as a comparative advantage. The unfortunate part is that India is not able to translate that comparative advantage into the exports, at least so far as the textiles and clothing is concerned. So I think this is a contentious one. India, we believe that if there is certain restriction on certain products on imports where India has a real comparative advantage over China, this could provide support to MSMEs. And while there is a lot of noise which is made over India being a protectionist regime, but let me tell you one important point is that in 2008, when the financial crisis started, US actually went inward by increasing its capability in the shale oil production. And today, look at where they are standing. And China also did the same thing. They ramped up their low-end manufacturing space, which space is now being vacated by China, and India wanted to get into that. So while we can debate over this debate of protectionism, whether the world is turning inward or not, but every country in the past, including US and China, had practiced it to develop self-sufficiency. How we are doing it, that's an important point. So as a concept, I don't see there is significant, I mean, I am not saying that we should get into some sort of a protectionist regime, but there are examples galore in the economic history of the world, which shows that countries have followed that path to develop self-sufficiency in their products. And in India, I think, has been trying to do that, as I showed you in some of the slides from imports from China. But unfortunately, the pandemic may have disrupted the transition, whereby our ultimate objective in the next 4 to 5 years is to have a trade balance with China. But I think we need to travel the distance in a fair manner. So India actually has a competitive advantage in a lot of products, but the unfortunate part, as I showed to you, is that India is unable to take advantage, maybe because of whatever infrastructure complexities or otherwise, because of this as compared to China. So this is one part which I wanted to show. The next important point, and this is basically some sort of a long-term story, that India has actually introduced a PLI in large sectors: automobiles, food, specialty steel, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, textiles, aviation. This PLI scheme has actually possibly could benefit top 15 commodity exports: drugs and pharma, mobile and electrical. We did a very simple exercise that potential of PLI can be found if we can reduce our import reliance of these commodities for China. Look into this table down. It shows that the imports of India from China in agricultural goods, electronics, where we import 28 billion, chemicals, textiles. Overall imports from China in these sectors were introduced, India has introduced, is 47 billion. Even if we can cut by this 20%, this 9 billion could be our addition to our overall GDP. And if we can cut by 30%, 12 billion, 50% isn't very ambitious, and by 20 billion. So basically, even if 1%, if we are able to cut or something like that, that could actually add 4 billion to our GDP. So this is one important point to understand, is that what we are doing in terms of the PLI scheme, the idea is very novel. And if it goes like this, I think maybe, and in the next couple of years, India could reduce the import dependency from China significantly in sectors where we are trying to develop our self-sufficiency, in terms of encouraging companies to set up shops to produce from India, in terms of the Make in India band. This is a slide which I wanted to show you. In a recent interview, I think former Governor Rajan had actually suggested that services should be the mainstay of Indian export strategy. Consultancy, it is true. I mean, to some extent, it is true that ITS, software consultancy services, accounted for a major proportion of Indian services exports. However, completely relying on services could be a misplaced idea. Because why? There are several issues regarding focusing on service exports alone. First is that there is a level of unemployment and low growth. Exclusive focus on services is not appropriate at this juncture, because I think services always follow the high skilled one. The necessary regulatory policies for development of services include, among others, I think these are all work in progression, issues of data privacy, storage and localization, which is difficult for India to negotiate in preferential trade agreements. India has also raised doubts on the legality of plurilateral agreements for development of these services. Digital trade domain under the WTO, and generally stayed out of these discussions. So if India was to get into a full push into the services, India need to get into this discussion and sort this out, which it has still done now. More importantly, Mode 4, the movement of professionals considered so far as India's comparative advantage in the services sector, has been the single most important factor for India's prolonged and often stalled services sectors. So this is one important area where India has made little progress. Even if we are assuming that the Mode 4 liberation has been included in the bilateral agreements, actual movement of professionals remains subject to difficulties of getting visas, language, and cultural barriers. So I think pushing of services exports is a matter of choice, and it's going to be a difficult choice if alone we are going to explain on it. All these exports should, however, not be the reasons for India not to shun its the approach of not exporting, not looking to the exports of services. But my point is that services and manufacturing has to be viewed as complementary and not as exclusive activities, as we have been trying to promote. I think a realignment of India's export strategy that views services as an integral part of manufacturing and structures the regulatory and trade policies will provide multiple benefits to India. And I think that trade agreements which India is trying to do with Australia, also in terms of employment, professionals, moving of people across the borders, could be the better way of looking into India's free trade agreements in the future, because manufacturing and services need to go together, not manufacturing or services. This is the emergence of new trade corridors through FTA. India is pushing for FTAs with major economies and regional blocks. Export target of 450 BT FY23. This year's India's target is actually between 500. India is exporting raw material or semi-processed goods. FTA will export increase of finished of intermediate goods. The growing list of countries and regional blocks negotiating trade deals with India includes UK, Russia, Canada, GCC, South African Customs Union. Trade deals has already been reached with the UAE and Australia. India wants the Asian countries to lower market restrictions in agriculture and automotive sectors, as well as reciprocate its own FTA concessions. These concerns are also why India walked away from the RCEP in November 2019, because India is also asking for concessions from these countries which have not got them. And that is also the reason of the APAC, which I showed to you. Asian blocs to do with non-tariff barriers, saying that equitable trades could between the two regions could be free trade flows worth around US 200 billion. So the idea of India is trying to emergence of the new trade corridor through the free trade agreements. This slide actually I'll just this is the India-Australian free trade treaty. 45 to 50 billion is the overall free trade agreement. This could generate around 10 lakh jobs. 85% of Australian exports will have zero duty access. This could include coal. Duties will be lower on Australian wines, cotton, almonds, lentils, fruits. Tariffs on Australians avocados will be reduced over 7 years. India will not relax tariffs on certain products considered sensitive sectors such as dairy products, wheat, rice, chickpeas. So basically these are all sectors which are sensitive, like the agricultural sector and the fruits. In services, this is the most important thing. Australia has offered 135 subsectors to India, where India offered 103 subsectors to Australia. Key areas of India's interest like education, IT, business, professional services, health have been committed by Australia under ECTA. So in the future, we can actually see, as you all of you know, it's happening in the gift city of Gujarat, is that education, the foreign universities and coming up and setting up shops. It could be also possible that in the future, we could have more and more Australian universities or education coming in the field of IT and the education. I think these are very good opportunities which could open up a larger share of India-Australia economic cooperation in the future, which could give job prospects and also agriculture, also manufacturing and services moving together. And that's exactly the point which I mentioned to you at the beginning. This is the India-UAE CEPA. Basically, duties for 90% of Indian exports will be eliminated. Major Indian imports from the UAE are petroleum, metals, gems and jewelry, others. Indian exports also, you know, textiles, engineering, machinery products, chemicals. I think engineering products, which is a highly skilled products, that actually offers a lot of scope for Indian exports. And this basically sets up 100 billion exports over the next 5 years. India-UK FTA negotiations also going on. India-Russia trade investment relationship could actually happen, but as of now, India and Russia has already signed 51 billion, so which is basically around US, it's a minor amount, 618 million. Russia has also agreed to produce long-term supplies of coal to India, but as of now, I think these things are in a limbo because of the recent geopolitical conflict. But as my point says, that over a point of time, I think these trade deals, individual trade deals could be the better way to go. I remember in 2015, there was a chapter in Economic Survey which showed that free trade agreements which India has done with other countries has not helped us significantly, because we have been always large importers and exporters. Hopefully, this time we'll be able to crack the whip in terms of having a positive trade deficit, or I mean a trade surplus with these countries where we are signing a free trade agreement. Some a little bit about the new foreign policy before I will talk about the recent geopolitical conflict. The prime objective of the FTP is to facilitate trade by reducing transaction cost and time. The new current FTP policy has actually consolidated various export intensive schemes, the MEIS and the SEIS schemes. The old FTP had certain limitations. The new FTP is actually working with state governments to implement district export hubs that will work towards achieving the export goals of each state. This is a very important initiative. I had a slide sometime earlier which actually showed that some of the states were exporting their items with their comparative advantage. But this is one of the aspects of the new foreign trade policy, which is very interesting. Next is some of the expectations from the of new foreign trade policy. WTA compliant tax incentives has already been rolled out. Easy credit access that is being rolled out from the banks. R&D service exports, e-commerce exports. According to Grant Thornton, there has been e-commerce sectors is the fastest growing sectors. So the new FTAP will have a separate chapter on the e-commerce. And the infrastructure upgrade and digitization, India needs to invest in upgrading export infrastructure such as ports, which is always the case when you are actually having and trying to push India's infrastructure. The additional expectation is that agricultural exports, PLI scheme is already geared to exports in 13 strategic areas, and new FTP should focus on introducing schemes in technological upgrade, innovation, and product development. So I'll just now, this is basically a data which I wanted to show you the limit utilization of the facilities as on December 21. So this is actually now being the export cash incentives is being worked out, and this shows that some of the initiatives the government has taken is actually working out if we just look into the data, because the limit utilization by export cash incentives was around 68% in December 2021. Finally, I'll just leave you with some interesting thoughts. This actually we have been pushing for the last 1 month when the war has broken out. I think the geopolitical scheme can actually be a blessing for the RBI because RBI is actually in the last policy also on February after the policy is done, the RBI actually rupee ruble cross currency pairing could be a harbinger for more concerted efforts to settle payments in non-dollar currencies. As we know that India has a very good sovereign financial management system, which all of you are aware of, which could be connected, which could remain, which could be used or advertised by the Reserve Bank of India while remain connected with the central government, central system like SWIFT. There are issues like cyber attacks and AML CFT measure adaptation, which I am sure the Reserve Bank will get into it. In fact, the idea the RBI could do well to explore bilateral netting of trading and contracts, making actual transfers for outstanding amount only at periodic frequency, while insisting on making rupee the base currency in settlement. The central bank can also ameliorating the indigenous SFMS system, which I just mentioned, along the lines of Russian SPFS or the Chinese CIPS system, offering a securable and reliable financial messages alternative to trading partners, leveraging CBDC that is estimated to take center stage in wholesale banking transactions going forward. So I think CBDC, as all of you know, if I just CBDC could be in terms of a retail digital currency and wholesale digital currency. I think in retail digital, we have already advanced a lot given the UPI transactions. I think the Reserve Bank could actually take a step in the wholesale banking transactions where it could leverage the CBDC technology. The bouncing back of ruble in recent days to almost pre-war levels with Europe's dependency on Russian energy being a catalyst. I think this shows that the ineffectiveness of the current sections, because Germany and Italy are likely to continue utilizing the SBR bank lifeline inbuilt in SWIFT sanctions. India could also build a dedicated payment mechanism for energy-related payment and settlement as a long-haul measure. In fact, if I am correct, we had actually also suggested to the government that for defense payments, we can start using the same payment mechanism which existed earlier around 2014 because of the current crisis. So the dichotomy and the payment and settlement financial messaging systems can be the new normal, and this could actually help us a lot in terms of the internationalization of the rupee. We have been talking a lot about them. This may sound a little trash at this point of time, but I think this is the best opportunity. This is one slide which I wanted to show you. US share in world GDP, US dollar has always been the natural store of value. It will continue to do so. But look into this one. The US share in global GDP is 20%, and US share of dollar share of international reserves is actually 60%. So this is the dichotomy of GDP and the foreign exchange reserves. This is the share of export investing. Dollar, almost 90% of America is export. Dollar is export in exports. Europe basically around 20%, rest of the world is around 80%. So there, I mean, dollar still remains the major currency. But my sense is that rupee there, I mean, given India's diplomatic power, given the way this geopolitical conflict has played out in the last 1.5 months, and given India's navigating through the crisis so far has been good enough in trying to take a neutral position, I think there is always an element whereby India could actually play a larger share, because the next slide shows you exactly the thing. There has been a changing landscape. There is a paper on IMF, we have written about that, is that there is a cross-border settlements. The US dollar has remained the natural choice of transaction, but the central banks are actually taking a wider role given the current geopolitical conflict. Renminbi and ruble are trying to gain, but in terms of the Chinese currency, there is always a trust factor, and ruble, as you know, because of the factors. And select central banks' forex reserves are already signaling asset diversification, assiduously built as a reserves. All the more case for Indian regulators and policy makers and bodies like FDI to seek equal and appropriate footing for INR in the changing realms, lest we lag behind in a crucial critical area. I think this is one important thing which I have been repeatedly emphasizing. Okay, US current account deficit, do you know that in one quarter is 23 times higher than India? And in 1950s and after in 1950s, there was this Bretton Woods system, but the Bretton Woods collapsed in 70s when the US came out with this logic that since the US dollar was linked to gold, so at one day the stock of gold will get exhausted, and then it went over to this the currency system, and then it started printing currency. In 2005, there was a famous speech by Barnard Cliff, all of you may be aware, whereby he took this argument to a different perspective, whereby saying that globally there is a savings glut, and it's this glut of the developing countries' savings which is financing our current account deficit. So therefore, to save the world, we have to supply dollar to the other countries, and we have to run a current account deficit. So that's the power of a sovereign currency. And the resurgence of ruble actually acknowledges the steps taken by the Russian central bank. And my sense is that the direct payment settlement platform which the RBI and the VEB are actually trying to explore may have factored this probability well by keeping individual banks outside the mechanism, cementing the safety net. I think that's the best way to go. This fluid scenario could throw many challenges, but so would be the opportunities. And we believe that there could be a new world order, at least in terms of the currency and trade algorithms. So I'd like to end here on a positive note, by saying that yes, the export story last year has been quite encouraging. This year it will continue. The export story will continue to do well if I just purely go by the price and the quantity effect and India's diversification. And finally, the important point to note is that I think the recent geopolitical conflict between Ukraine and Russia has perhaps opened up a window for opportunity for rupee again. We had been pushing this idea now for the last several years, but now I think is the best opportunity for organization. I think FDI and others are best placed to take this opportunity forward and to ask for an appropriate footing of an INR. We are actually the 5th largest country in terms of the world. I mean, there could be always debate in terms of growth and other things, but may not be any debate on trying to get an equal and appropriate footing of our domestic currency, which reflects our inherent domestic and economic fundamentals and the largest democracy. So I'd like to end here, and I'll be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ghosh. Thanks a lot. You have covered much more than what I had expected or what we had anticipated. So by the time, I think it's let the people absorb what all you have said. And one thing, in case anybody has got a question to ask to Dr. Ghosh, you can feel free to either raise your hand or you can type in the question and Q&A box. And in the meanwhile, Doctor, just a few things which come to my mind. Some of the positive which you have highlighted about that price and quantity effect, which as you mentioned that it's a positive as far the exports are concerned, because the uptick is mainly price driven, mainly the quantity driven, whereas on the import the uptick is price driven. So these both the things are looking good going forward, even if there is a temporarily trade deficit is increasing, maybe with the turn of the cycle we'll be in a better position. And you also mentioned about the diversification in terms of commodity basket as well as in terms of destination. That again, you have given some positive signs that we are getting better diversified going forward. And one thing which comes to my mind is, though you have mentioned in terms of percentage of GDP, our export is still not very high. So based on this last year's numbers, and government has already got very ambitious targets for the next year. We are already talking about 500 billion for the current year, and maybe very soon touching 1 trillion as well on the merchandising export itself. So with the combination of all these things, with the PLI, with that FTA coming in place and these things, how confident are you about these, that uptrend? Do you see India coming into that category where we can say that India is big, we can say term India as an export powerhouse, where we can see that our export constitutes maybe more than 50-60% of our GDP, which is a case with some other Asian nations also? That's the first point which I would like to have your views on that. And second, you have mentioned about the FTP also, you have covered. You mentioned about that e-commerce is going to be the focus area on that. So on that, all along, when I see our foreign trade policies have been, you can say that incentive driven. That's how it has been. Whether we have been giving MSI, SEIS scheme or MEIS scheme and all those things. Even now we are talking about remission of duties and taxes, etc. ROTEP scheme, which we are talking about. Should there be a focus? Has the time come when the focus has to increase more on the infrastructure, more on that capability side, rather than incentive driven, though PLI is going to continue, I know. And the third piece, which I would like to have very briefly your views on that, though I know you have been one of the proponent for internationalization of rupee. Clearly, this is the time. And there you mentioned in terms of percentage of invoicing, Europe, the dollar invoicing is almost 20-25%, where in Asia still it continues to be 70%. Maybe that is something which is even within Asia, if we can create either through FTAs or either through the regional coordination, etc., we can create more like an regional vehicles where it can be more like domestic currency bill invoicing rather than going to the dollar, which is a third party currency, nothing to do with any of that importer export or whatever the APEC trade we are looking, or trade within Asia we are looking. If that component of 60-70% dollar invoicing within Asia region, that can be brought down. So do you see that how realistic the chances of India getting a considerable share is in that, especially compared to yuan has got its own pluses and minuses, but there are other large economies also which have got maybe a considerable say in that global markets or the global in terms of global trade as well. So these are the 3 points which I would like to cover, and then maybe quickly we'll come back to the questions which some of the people have already put in over there.
Okay, so I'll just come and go slowly by this one. See, exports as a percentage of GDP, you have mentioning that it could be, I mean, 50 to 60%. Frankly, I'll tell you that I'll be very happy if we are at 25% peak the level. Let me give you an example. India always has been a country which has been driven by domestic consumption. If you take the FY03 to 88 numbers, I believe these numbers we had estimated some time back. We had actually calculated the weighted contribution of consumption expenditure from the C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and the weighted contribution of consumption expenditure and the weighted contribution of the, please note that India actually has a India's net export is negative because India's X minus M is always negative. So from that point of view, X minus exports can add positively, but higher X minus M is always actually pulling down the GDP from that point of view. So we just did an exercise for the exports. You will be surprised that during the heydays of the FY3 to 8, the total weighted contribution of consumption expenditure in overall GDP growth was around 65%. And the exports, I think that was the peak exports was actually close to 50%. The point which you mentioned, that was peak. So that was the highest level of weighted contribution of exports to GDP growth during the crisis from 2004 to 2000, last 7 years. However, the contribution of exports has significantly declined. I think it declined to sometime, I think, lower than 10% at some point of time. It has since then increased to around close to 20%, but the share of consumption still remains at more than 70%. At some point of time, it was more than 80%. So my sense, I'll be very happy even if you are able to reach a weighted contribution of only, I'm talking about the exports, weighted contribution of exports of around 40%. So because that in case will mean that the share of domestic consumption remains at around 65% or so. So this is the first point. The second question, if I remember what you asked me, is about the rupee internationalization. Yes, so we have been vouching very hard for the rupee internationalization. I think as I showed to you in the graph is that Asia, there is a significant amount of opportunity, and there are, I mean, various ways to get about it. I think one way is basically the trade deals. The other way, actually, I think India should now actively explore is that India is also a part of the BRIC one. So basically BRIC, as all of you know, has put up a fund of around 100 billion to help countries in times of crisis. If we remember, there was an article, there has been concept of this Bancor, which the US monetary, which the national, which the international system, the national account system is also pushing for the last several years. I think why not use that BRICS fund, which has been developed by all these countries, to give to all the member countries some equiproportionate share in that reserves. So I think in some of these ways, India can actually try to extract a pound of flesh for this rupee, because I think at some point of time, this will be very important, because China's renminbi has always the trust factor. So people will believe Indian rupee much more than the renminbi. And given the fact that we have done so far so much on the digitization of front, I think it will be easier for us. This is one of the points which I also mentioned in the slide, the digitization of the express and other things. I think it will be useful for us to go along and treat along that path. We have actually written about this BRICS concept, and that will come in one of the articles 1 and 2 days later. But that basically says the same thing. If you look into the share of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, what was the amount of gold and what was the amount of other currencies, it was around 42%. So Russia actually has been working on this concept for the last 7 years. The way they have actually linked it to the gold, how far it will open, it's not a matter or not, it's a matter of debate. But I think they have planned this very carefully, knowing that it could actually, that war could take a large amount of time. So my sense is that Iran also, we had done some point of time. So why not explore these options and try to do this? Because another thing is that, you know, that we have done so much on this from this RuPay card. This RuPay card is now the international platform which we have now is relevant in 195 countries. So this payment infrastructure could also be used to push rupee as an international currency. So this is basically, I mean, these are some of the things which has been happening over a point of time. And given these things, I don't see any reason that at least we, even if we can able to push up say 5 or 10% of our overall exports in rupee, that will be very useful for us in terms of saving down the foreign exchange reserves. So my sense is that we can do it, and there are ways to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. And Doctor, just one thing, many people are interested to know whether we'll be able to share this presentation.
Yeah, I will share the presentation.
All right, then we'll put it on our website. Maybe people
Yes.
will be able to access it. So I've got Mr. Sunil Bhagwanani. Sunil, I'm just unmuting you. You can ask your question. Yeah, please. Please go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just want to understand, how do we take advantage of this e-commerce boom which is happening, wherein we use these platforms for better exports from India. Right now, whatever we see, whether Amazon is there or Flipkart is there, it is more import driven. I mean, we still need to see more benefit on the export side.
No, I think this is a very interesting question, and I think I was just about to mention this. All of you know that India is actually pushing for this ONDC platform, this Open National Digital E-commerce platform. And I think that is again an opportunity for us. I think this e-commerce we are talking about, whereby over a point of time, this platform, I don't know how this platform is going to shape up, but the way we have been trying to push, and I think most of these Amazon, Flipkarts are the planning to be a part of this platform. So my sense is that this platform, coupled with the other initiatives which the government has taken on the RuPay front, the payment infrastructure, I think at some point of time, this could be integrated with the overall e-commerce initiative on the e-commerce which the government is trying to do. I am not sure about, I mean, the ONDC is going to work, because this is a very complex exercise whereby you are trying to get everybody on an open platform. But my sense is that this could be the starting point. And to the question which you asked in terms of how can we use the e-commerce in trying to push our exports. So I think maybe this could be the best option to look into that as an alternative.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. We hope good for India on this front, because this is one of the area where we can really, speed up our export growth. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Sunil. And so I think we have already gone past our scheduled allocated time. I know you also had some other engagements. With that, we'll just stop here. There are one or two other questions which I'll address online, offline, because these are more operations related, nothing to do with the policy, that we'll take it up. So with that, I sincerely, on behalf of IDAI and on behalf of all our members, convey our sincere thanks for sparing time, for sharing with us this exhaustive research and the analysis which you have provided to us. I'm sure that it will go a long way in helping our members get better understanding, but more clarity about the way India's exports or the international trade is heading, and we'll be in a better position to exploit the emerging opportunities and benefit from that. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Have a safe time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.